Hello everyone, Bag here. Dan Heng PT is coming as our next free limited unit in the second half of 3.6. So if you want to know how he can slot into your account's teams, then this is the video for you. For a TLDR on Dip's kit, he is an attack scaling shielder with a couple of key utilities. For one, at the start of combat, he designates one ally as the bondmate, giving them a summon named Soul Dragon, who has a speed of 165. This summon, on its turn, shields and cleanses the team, but after Dip's ultimate, which is otherwise just an AoE hit that reshields the team with the same shield as a skill, Soul Dragon's next two moves also include an AoE hit that starts with an initial hit from Dipped, before then adding on an AoE hit of additional damage that uses the attack and crit of the bondmate. The other two important things to note here is that Dipped gives the bondmate a permanent attack buff that directly scales off of Dipped's attack, and that whenever the bondmate ally attacks, Soul Dragon gets action advanced by 15% and Dipped gets 6 energy. It's a relatively simple kit, so let's not stall the list any further. The very first thing that we need to talk about before anything else is his single largest synergy that directly affects a lot of other units' placements. Sunday! Yeah, Sunday. Sunday by himself is no doubt a top 3 unit in the game, and this is with the fact that with most of the units that he supports, his skill's additional effect remains unactivated. If he skills someone with a summon, they get a total of 80 damage percent rather than 30. Dipped allows this buff to be given to any unit, instead of, well, just these units. So you can essentially treat this 50 damage percent as coming from Dipped. As with any other sustain in this same scenario, it is impossible to access. I don't think I need to tell you that 50 damage percent is insane from a sustain, combined also with his attack buff and Soul Dragon's AoE hits. Comparing this to the single target 15% crit damage buff from Aventurine, or Ho-Ho's 2-turn 40% attack buff, and yeah, for most attack scaling carries, when used with Sunday, their highest damaging option without just going sustainless is just to run Dipped, full stop. There is also, of course, the synergy that comes from advancing forward Soul Dragon with every Sunday skill. More frequent shields from Soul Dragon's turns means it's easier to be completely SP positive with Dipped, or it could also mean getting all of Soul Dragon's AoE hits earlier, which can obviously result in faster clears. One key thing about this action advance is that wherever the skill recipient and their summon are in the action bar, Sunday always places the summon behind the main unit. Here, that sucks, since it means that the unit's next turn completely wastes the action advances that their hits can generate. One way to get around this is to use an out of turn hit after the action advance but before their turn starts. That hit pushes the Soul Dragon ahead of them, meaning that it can then benefit from their hits as normal. But yeah, regardless of any synergies or whatever, Dipp's strength in the meta is largely contingent on Sunday's prominence. For the sake of this tier list format, I'm gonna be temporarily introducing an S+ tier to put Sunday in, because, as you'll see in a bit, the gap between him and other S tiers is otherwise kinda hard to depict. Moving on to the actual carries that use him, and well, the best way to articulate Dip's synergies is to go by a series of yes or no questions. There are many factors in play that can get in the way of him being best in slot, so let's just go through them one by one. First off, does the unit rely on other sustained utilities to perform optimally? One of the larger examples is Saber, who really wants Ho-Ho's 72 energy per ultimate, as not only is that a huge amount of energy for her, but the 26 energy to Sunday can also help him get more ults off in the fight as well, which is then another 72 energy for Saber before even counting the extra core resonance. Dipped of course wins out here in terms of raw damage. Sunday is best in slot for Saber, and Dipped activates that extra 50 damage percent, and with how many turns Saber takes thanks to Mana Burst, a permanent attack buff suits her a lot better than Ho-Ho's that lasts 2 turns. But the comparison here frankly depends on how much this damage makes up for the loss of energy. If Ho-Ho only leads to 1 more ult compared to Dipped, then Dipped will win out, but if she leads to 2 or more ults, then she will be better. This is fully fight dependent based on how much energy the enemy gives the team. Energy is thresholds based, so it's hard to articulate its impact when it's really all or nothing. The other important factor here and with other units is with Robin, as Ho-Ho's ult can be the difference between getting her ult back up in time or not. So here again, it's fight dependent on how much energy the enemies give Robin, but it's just another important factor to consider. Overall, Saber deserves to be at the bottom of S. If you don't have Ho-Ho for her, he is your second best option by far, and if Ho-Ho's energy doesn't make a big enough difference, then he wins outright. Even when Ho-Ho wins out though, I still think Dip does a good enough job to be in the S tier regardless. Other units with high energy caps that appreciates Ho-Ho's percentage max energy buff, like Argenti, Yunli, or stretching it also Clara, do prefer her to Dipped most of the time, because at least in their relevant pure fiction scenarios, spamming ults for momentum is usually more important than higher damage, at least in the earlier perfection waves. Their SP problems with Ho-Ho can be a lot more defined compared to Saber, so the argument can be made that Dipt is best in slot regardless. I won't be making that argument, but I think it's pretty fair to believe it regardless. Another yes or no question is, well, does the unit already have a summon? Because if they do, then the Sunday synergy is rather redundant. An obvious example here is Jing Yuan, where yes, like Argenti and Yunli, he can utilize Dipt's generic sustain very well, but at base, he's just plainly getting less raw stats from Dipt. He still does go into the S tier though, mainly just because there really isn't another sustain that gives him any worthwhile offensive utility while being so comfortable SP wise. But this is with the same caveat as with Saber, where Robin can be a lot harder to use without Ho-Ho's energy assistance. Another notable benefit here is that Dipt's constant shield refreshes with Soul Dragon is a lot more amicable than Aventurine shields, which are much more prone to run out in -1 speed setups if the enemy isn't constantly refreshing them. Moving on, the only other really relevant summon unit is Aglaea, where she suffers in both questions so far. Not only does she already have a summon, but she also relies on Ho-Ho's energy even more than Saber does, thanks to her more punishing energy rotation. At E1 Aglaea, Dipt can become a lot more competitive, but I don't think he can ever thoroughly be best in slot without any question. The next very obvious question is, does the unit even use Sunday? A unit like Archer would really like Dipt's completely SP positive playstyle and substantial buffs, but by using Sparkle instead of Sunday, half of Dipt's buffing goes out the window. Still, to look at Archer more closely, the obvious comparison to make is with Gallagher, where you trade SP generation for much better sustain and actual offensive utility. Dipt is more weighed down by needing to invest into other stats besides speed for his utility, and he also doesn't get the Warrior Goddess set, meaning that he will be slightly slower than Gallagher despite their almost equal base speed. And for every ult Gallagher gets off, that's half a skill that Dipt is not generating. Still, if we arbitrarily say that Archer does about 20% more damage with Dipt, and he does maybe 10% less skills in a fight, that is still an increase on average. And this is ignoring Gallagher's much less prominent healing, which is not only relevant since Sparkle can't heal herself because she normally doesn't hit enemies, but there has also been a lot of hard-hitting content in a lot of the recent endgame rotations, including the upcoming Anomaly Arbitration. Also, if you have an SP surplus, like if a gimmick in a fight gives Sparkle back-to-back ults or something, then Gallagher's SP generation carries a lot less weight, obviously. The other obvious point here is Dipt's E1, where he not only gives 18 res pen, but a skill point after ulting, letting him better match Gallagher on the one point he was competitive on. I think even without Dipt's E1, Archer should still be in the S tier. Also, if you don't have Sparkle and you are stuck using Sunday, then Dipt is more easily the best in slot option. But with how large of a boost Sparkle is for him, that's not too relevant to consider for this list. Another relevant unit who doesn't use Sunday is Heislands, or more so Dot as a whole. Triple Dot teams are usually rather SP hungry, which can make Ho-Ho rather hard to slot in, but they aren't so SP hungry to where replacing Gallagher with Dipt is as much of a pain as it can be for Archer, meaning that he's really easy to slot in as a generic option. However, there are two main problems here. For one, Dipt's buff is single target, and while damage distribution is not even on Heislands teams at all, only buffing Heislands is still a negative. Also, if you can make Ho-Ho's SP work, then she is just flat out better. All three Dot units' ults are incredibly important to get off as much as possible, and unlike Saber, Dipt's damage does a worse job closing that gap thanks to Sunday's absence. If you play Heislands slow, then Ho-Ho's 2-turn attack buff has a lot more manageable uptime, compared again to someone like Saber, who burns through turns really fast. In Duo Dot, Ho-Ho is a lot easier to use, and even in teams with shaky SP like with Robin, as stated previously, you would want Ho-Ho for Robin's energy anyways. So Heislands goes to the bottom of the S tier. My Heislands teammate tier list had Gallagher and Ho-Ho both in the S tier, and I think Dipt can just go right in between them. I guess Kafka and Black Swan can go here too, since first, realistically, you aren't playing Heislands without Kafka, so wherever Heislands is good, Kafka is equally as good, I guess. So even though Kafka isn't really interacting directly with most of Dipt's mechanics, having them on the same team is still usually as good of an idea as it is with Heislands. The same logic can then also be applied to Black Swan, although she's obviously less omnipotent than Kafka in Dot teams. Oh, actually, one thing to know about Kafka is that, like with Robin, you can do the whole give 75% effective rate to Dipt for 100% attack thing, if you want to make gear for him for specifically this team and nowhere else. But if you do that, then yeah, that's a genuinely good synergy. A plug here to subscribe. We are close to the 3.7 content cycle with Cyrene, so if you want full coverage of her pre-release cycle, then stick around. A guide for Dipt should also come out relatively soon. I promise this time, surely. So sub to see that as well. Alright, back to the vid. For the next batch of units, oh boy, this is gonna be a tricky one. So, Feixiao and the Herta. They, more than just buffs, want sustains that can attack frequently. Does Dipt do that? Kinda. He basics, his ult is an AoE hit, and then Soul Dragon does 2 AoE hits per ult. So he can do more than Hyacine, since her skill and ults aren't hits, but if she just spam basics instead, then she's still ahead. Although comparing just these two, you can still argue that the buffs make up the difference. The real question is with Aventurine, who entirely relies on the enemy for his attack frequency. So against enemies with frequent AoE attacks, Aventurine wins by far. But with enemies that just spend their time dicking around all day, Dipt wins by far instead. There's also Linkjaw, more so for the Herta, who doesn't really depend on the enemy outside of proccing her emergency heal, where she can win on stack generation outright in exchange for providing 0 relevant buffs. So you can probably tell that this mirrors both Saber and Dot so far. It's less specialized utility in exchange for more damage, in which case it's super hard to determine how much that utility will end up mattering, since it not only depends on if the competition's higher generation will actually lead to that many extra ults, but it also depends on how much higher that generation ends up being, since it's fight dependent. This is also a good time to mention that for Feixiao, her frequent attacks mesh really well with Dipt, giving him a good amount of extra energy, which can then lead to more hits with his ult. So I guess it's pretty obvious that I'm just going to go the same route as with Dot and Saber. Again, the S tier doesn't strictly mean this unit is always best in slot. It just means that they work really well together in an at least almost optimal level most of the time. I'll also just place every sub DPS that works with these two. For units like Topaz and Mose, they directly depend on the sustained follow-up frequency as much as Feixiao does. Whereas for Jade and March, they're more so here for the same logic as Kafka. I'll also place Mini Herta differently, since you can still run her as a hypercarry, in which case Dipt is basically best in slot always. Also, for both of them, you can slot in Sunday to make the most of Dipt's synergy, but this is usually worse than just running their best in slot team at base. Sunday can work with the Herta, assuming you have one or preferably both of their Lycones for SP generation, but Tribi will still be generally preferred. And you can replace either Cypher or Robin with Sunday, but neither options are that ideal. If you want to though, then go for it. It's still really good, just not their literal best in slot team. The next yes or no question, do they scale off of attack? Yeah, get down there you HP scalers. Alright, anyways, Acheron is another interesting case here. As with Jiaoshu losing more and more prominence in Acheron teams, Trend can then make a bit of a comeback, since there's no longer the anti-synergy where Trend and Ashen Roast can't both proc on the same action. Trend does have equal base attack to all but 2 4-star preservation Lycones, although it obviously is still much worse than just running a high base attack Lycone like Yanqing signature on him. So for hard-hitting fights, Trend might not be too viable, although Acheron teams are usually relatively comfortable SP-wise, to where scaling with Dipt isn't the end of the world. But yeah, for Trend stacking, he's pretty decent, although there's again a trade-off where Aventurine's ult has a debuff, and his signature gives a debuff on his follow-ups in exchange for losing Trend. But on the other hand, Dipt's permanent non-enemy single target buffs more than make up for this in my opinion. If you are using Jiaoshu, where Dipt is then competing against the debuffs from Gallagher, Hyacinth with his signature, or Aventurine with his signature, it's another fulfilling round of less utility but more damage. Sometimes the competition's generation will lead to one more ult in the fight, sometimes it won't, and sometimes Dipt's damage will make that extra ult not worth it to go for in any case. This is also a good time to mention that if we are considering Aventurine and Hyacinth's signatures, then his own signature gives the bondmate and other summon allies 36 damage percent, the rest of the team 24 damage percent, a much larger shield, and a larger attack buff. For all of the it depends energy threshold based units so far, his Lycone at the very least ups that worst case performance from being, well, still an S tier performance, to a much higher S tier performance, if that makes any sense. Back to Acheron though, like with the other units, I think Acheron should still be placed at the very least at the bottom of the S tier, which at this point is like half of the tier. Also, you can flat out just run Aventurine's signature on Dipt for the same benefit since he has a follow-up, although obviously the low base attack and defense buffs don't really do anything for him. The next gigantic batch of units to talk about are the good old bottom tiers, where while they can have synergy with Dipt, like notably with Yanqing and to a lesser extent Arlen, it's not really like Dipt makes them any more viable. If they have synergy, but they still can't clear fast enough without uber high investment, then I don't really want to muddle the tier list with them, frankly. But if you really want to use them alongside your E2S1 Sunday and Tribbies, then yes, Dipt can obviously be best in slot, so long as they don't have any energy issues that Ho-Ho patches up. There are some other units who barely get out of this tier. Like, we can put Qingcui in S tier for the same basic reasons as with Archer, and his twin Dill can be put there too with the same reasoning of his SP concerns. Ratio can be low S considering Dipt doesn't have any debuffs without using Trend, but otherwise he's solid, and Sile likes the higher damage contribution to make resurgences easier. Although more so for her, I think her meta relevance sort of hinges on going sustainless to hit resurgence proc damage thresholds, which makes it dubious to place a sustain so high for her. I still think they're okay enough with high investment to escape the Yanqing tier, but if you think otherwise then I frankly wouldn't blame you. At the end of these yes or no questions, we have a unit who doesn't rely on other sustained utility, does use Sunday, doesn't already have a summon, they're attack scaling, they're relevant enough in the meta to be extremely notable in their synergy with him, and they don't have other other random mechanics that would otherwise invalidate his dominance. If we apply all of these filters, well, we have one unit, Anaxa. Most of the good things that could be said about this synergy have already been implied by the yes or no questions that I just mentioned. With Anaxa's S1, his 2-turn ult rotation is so perfect that Ho-Ho's energy is largely irrelevant, outside of maybe giving his ult 1 turn sooner with the addition of enemy hits. Besides her previously mentioned Robin buffing utility, her attack buff for Anaxa has been uncontested. But, well, now it is. Anaxa gains a considerable amount of damage from Dipped, as not only is he relatively attack starved in his kit, so Dipped's buff is extra good here, but the 50 damage percent from Sunday is completely free and uncontested, unlike in a lot of the previously mentioned other teams. Anaxa also gives a lot back to Dipped thanks to his frequent attacks. Like, if you have Cerebro with him, a quadruple skill gives a 60% action advance to Soul Dragon and 24 energy to Dipped, which is a lot and more than any other carry can do by far. His variable ultimate also makes it relatively easy to do the aforementioned ult to push Soul Dragon ahead of Sunday's action advance strategy, assuming you aren't doing any Eagle shenanigans. Finally, for one last bit of synergy, Anaxa's implants means that all of Dipped's AoE hits will do physical toughness damage, meaning faster breaks, which means more damage from Anaxa. If there is any unit who fully benefits from Dipped without any caveats, besides Robin losing Ho-Ho, it's Anaxa. I'm not placing him above Sunday, but he very obviously deserves to be paired with him in the S+ tier. The last large archetype to tackle is Break, in which Dipped is, well, nothing special. Break and HP are really the only archetypes with specialized utility in their sustains that fully caters to only that archetype, more so than what Dipped does for attack scalers. So Dipped has a harder time breaking into this niche, as he just gives less useful stats. Before, Soul Dragon's follow-ups would also inherit the break effect of the bondmate, which could result in some genuinely impressive super break damage. Now, this is unfortunately not the case, meaning the only real synergy Dipped provides is his AoE physical toughness damage. For Boot Hill, yay, Boot Hill! That alone is pretty good, as the only other physical sustain is Natasha, but the real answer is that most competitive Boot Hill teams are sustainless these days anyways. For Firefly, there's really no reason to field him over Gallagher or Linkshot thanks to her fire implant, and Rappa would want Linkshot or Gallagher's high toughness damage to help with her talent stacking, especially if you bestow Linkshot with Fugue skill. The same also goes for Himiko and Shuei, where overall he's usable with all of them, but he is pretty thoroughly outclassed. The last unit to talk about, then, is the one and only Phainon. Phainon working with Dipped has been a contentious topic since day one. Yes, Dipped can activate Sunday's damage percent, and also yes, he can activate Phainon's second trace for another 45 damage percent, but at base, that is still a bit less than just using another support instead. Right now, for most content, you can get by with going sustainless on Phainon, even if it's uncomfortable. Anomaly arbitration might change that, in which case Dipped does become a lot more important, but for most of the endgame in any case, Dipped's utility of sustaining is not strictly needed. With another support, the biggest difference maker besides raw damage is in Core Flame generation. Dipped only generates Core Flame in one way, with his shielding skill. Soul Dragon's turn doesn't, his ult doesn't, only his skill does. Dipped does skill at the start of combat for free, so that's a free stack in the same vein as Ceredra's free skill, but after that, he becomes as much of an SP black hole as someone like Branya, assuming you skill with him every turn, but without the extra buffs and still with less Core Flame stacks. Soul Dragon does follow Phainon into his territory, meaning that its shielding and damage don't have any downtime issues. This is good that it works like this, but for right now, Phainon has enough self-sustaining while alone to where the shielding isn't really needed in the average fight. For completely optimal play right now, Phainon does not need Dipped, but if you really want to, or maybe in the future need to, then yes, Dipped is his best sustain by far, and it's really not that close. In a future where it's unrealistic to run sustainless on Phainon, then this pairing will become a lot more important, but for now, it's just good, but by no means optimal most of the time. I think there's a solid argument to put him at the bottom-ish of S, or at the top of A. With that assumption that Dipped will become more relevant later on, I'll place him in the S tier, but as with a lot of the units here, it's more of an S- than anything else. And with that, that's the list. I think this gets across just how universal of a unit Dipped can be, and although there's usually a caveat or two in a given team that holds him back from being that insane of an upgrade, his baseline performance is still good enough to get him a teammate tier list that looks like, well, this. Going to the channel member corner, we have HSR Journey and Leon Soliloquy as our next new members. Thank you so much to all of you yet again, and well, with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye!